Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's midweek message from Messiah Lutheran Church in Mechanicsville, Virginia. My name is Pastor Ryan Radke. Glad that you're with us one more time, or if it's your first time, welcome. We've been doing a series this month of June that I've called Lutheran Stories. So what I'm doing is I've got two books that I'm just basically reading to you from, which might seem weird, like why am I tuning in to hear somebody read to me? But it's because you might not have these books on your shelf, and they're interesting. Each of these books was written on either side of the big 500th anniversary of the Reformation in 2017, and both of them are sort of a series, a collection of short essays, little pieces on different people, different events, different places, what it is to be Lutheran, Lutheran history, Lutheran heritage, Lutheran theology, Lutherans around the world through history, and looking forward into what Lutheranism will be doing in its 6th century. The first book is called Together by Grace, and it is edited by Catherine Kleinhans. Introducing the Lutherans is the subtitle on that one. And the second one is called Stories from Global Lutheranism, a Historical Timeline. That's by Martin J. Lorman. And both of these are available through augsburgfortress.org. You'll just get little excerpts, but I hope maybe you'll consider ordering these and reading a little more deeply on your own, because over the course of this month, you've just gotten a little sampling of what's in these books. I hope it is enticing enough that you want to go deeper and wider and get some more. This week, our pair of stories are sort of about Lutherans handling big issues. Lutheran theology is amazing. I'm biased, but I think it's pretty awesome. And it can be applied to navigate some really tricky, complicated stuff in our lives. As much as we'd like to have everything be black and white, there's a lot of gray in life. And Lutheran teachings, Lutheran theology, Lutheran lens of scripture are very helpful in terms of navigating the gray and when to take a stand. Luther was famously misquoted for saying, "Here I stand, I can do no other," when he was being asked to recant his teachings and just toe the line. That we're kind of talking about matters that right now Lutherans are considering or have considered to say, here I stand. We have to do something about this. Our faith, our God compels us to. So we're going to start in the Stories from Global Lutheranism book. And we're going to go back to June of 1977. The Lutheran World Federation declares apartheid a status confessionis. I'll explain that in a second. At the 1977 assembly in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, the Lutheran World Federation declared that resisting the racial politics of apartheid was a matter of status confessionis, a situation demanding public confession of faith. In other words, something so grounded to the centrality of the gospel that you have to speak up about it. You have to speak out against it in this case, because apartheid was contrary to the very core of the gospel of freedom, of God's love, of grace in Jesus Christ. With origins in the adiaphoristic controversy, one second, I'll explain that. Well, adiaphora is a fun Latin word, or Greek word, excuse me, that is found in Lutheran theology. Adiaphora means everything that isn't the center. So that'd be not status confessionis. So the type of music we use in worship, the color of the carpet, I guess currently, whether or not we are able to sing in worship or wear masks in worship, when it comes down to those things, we feel strongly about them, but are they central to the gospel? No, they're not. Each congregation and community can kind of figure it out what works for them. So coming back, with origins in the adiaphoristic controversy, this doctrinal standpoint was expressed in the 1577 Formula of Concord, which asserted, "We believe, teach, and confess that in a time of persecution, when an unequivocal confession of the faith is demanded of us, we dare not yield to the opponents in such indifferent matters." In Latin, rebus adiaphoris. As the apostle wrote, "Stand firm in the freedom for which Christ has set us free, and do not submit again to the yoke of slavery," Galatians 5:1. For in such a situation, it is no longer indifferent matters that are at stake. The truth of the gospel and Christian freedom are at stake. The confirmation of open idolatry, as well as the protection of the weak and faith from offense, is at stake. In such matters, we can make no concessions, but must offer an unequivocal confession and suffer whatever God sends and permits the enemies of his world to inflict on us. There's your theological basis for status confessionis. Members of the Confessing Church, if you were following our Dietrich Bonhoeffer series back during Lent, that's what he was a part of, teaching in their seminary. Members of the Confessing Church had invoked this principle in their protests against the Nazification of the church in Germany in the 1930s. Only a few decades later, Lutherans came to apply this confessional stand to the apartheid policies governing South Africa, which included Namibia. Although long the de facto policy of South Africa, in 1948 apartheid became the official law of the government led by Afrikaners, white descendants of Dutch colonists. It was based upon white supremacy and strict racial categorization and segregation. As the South African comedian and author Trevor Noah described it in his memoir, Born a Crime, apartheid was perfect racism. It took centuries to develop. As the British Empire fell, the Afrikaner, descendants of Dutch colonists, rose up to claim South Africa as his rightful inheritance. To maintain power in the face of the country's rising and restless black majority, the government realized they needed a newer and more robust set of tools. They set up a formal commission to go out and study institutionalized racism all over the world. They went to Australia. They went to the Netherlands. They went to America. They saw what worked, what didn't. Then they came back and published a report, and the government used that knowledge to build the most advanced system of racial oppression known to man. End quote. Internal resistance to apartheid arose in groups like the African National Congress in South Africa and its Namibian counterpart, SWAPO, Southwest Africa People's Organization. International objections to apartheid also started to grow, with criticism from the United Nations increasing in the 1960s and a global boycott organized against South Africa taking place in the 1980s. Lutheranism had come to Namibia through missionaries from Germany and Finland. Germans and Scandinavians also started mission work in South Africa in the 19th century. As discussed in the 4th chapter earlier in this book, German colonial rule of Namibia had included the genocide and displacement of native people. By the time of apartheid, Black Lutherans in Namibia had developed vibrant indigenous churches, even as many white Lutheran churches supported the government and its racist laws. In the 1960s, Black Lutherans in Namibia were active members of SWAPO, publicly calling for an end to apartheid. A 1971 letter to the South African Prime Minister from Bishop Aula of the Ovambo Kavango Church and Pastor Gowaseb, a leader in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Southwest Africa, concluded, "The Church Board's urgent wish is that in terms of the declaration of the World Court and in cooperation with the United Nations, of which South Africa is a member, your government will seek a peaceful solution to the problems of our land and will see to it that human rights be put into operation and that Southwest Africa may become a self-sufficient and independent state." Many Christians, including those belonging to the World Council of Churches and the Roman Catholic Church, worked to confront the injustices of apartheid. The issue came directly before the Lutheran World Federation at the 1977 Assembly in Dar es Salaam, and the resolution to declare apartheid a status confessionis, an essential matter of faith requiring a clear, principled stand. Especially poignant was that Black Lutheran churches in South Africa and Namibia were committed to unity without regard to race, while the white Lutheran churches did not welcome Black Christians to common worship or to participation in the sacrament of the altar. This resolution came after white Lutherans supporting apartheid had already failed to honor a 1970 LWF statement calling for racial inclusion in the sacrament of Holy Communion. After much discussion, the Assembly passed a statement titled Statement on Southern Africa, Confessional Integrity, which said, "Under normal circumstances, Christians may have different opinions in political questions. However, political and social systems may become so perverted and oppressive that it is consistent with the confession to reject them and to work for changes. We especially appeal to our white member churches in Southern Africa to recognize that the situation in Southern Africa constitutes a status confessionis. This means that, on the basis of faith and in order to manifest the unity of the church, churches would publicly and unequivocally reject the existing apartheid system. In the following years, the two LWF member churches supporting apartheid did not change their whites-only policies. These churches, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Southern Africa and the German Evangelical Lutheran Church in Southwest Africa, Namibia, were therefore suspended from membership by a vote of the next LWF assembly, which was held in Hungary in 1984. This action also increased worldwide Lutheran participation in the boycott of South Africa and support for Namibian independence. Apartheid ended with Namibian independence in 1990 and a series of democratic elections in South Africa in the early 1990s. Lutherans had played a prominent role in SWAPO and continue to provide public and religious leadership in Namibia. With the end of apartheid, the Lutheran World Federation lifted its suspension of the two denominations in 1991, though racial separation remains a reality among Lutherans in South Africa and Namibia. I can speak from experience on that one. We had the opportunity to go to Namibia, a group of us from seminary, in January of 2006. 2005. And there were three major Lutheran bodies in the country, the ELCRN and the ELCIN, which were predominantly African Black churches in the South and the North. And then there was still even the German Evangelical Lutheran Church in Southwest Africa, which was still predominantly white. So that separation still remained, even though the country ended the apartheid policies, the separation still remains. And that's one of the works continuing, is to find common ground. Continuing. To this end, Professor Elewani Bethuel Farasani wrote that the church has a role to play in encouraging coexistence and harmony among different ethnic groups. Thus, it will have to insist that there is nothing wrong with ethnicity, but the problem is the polarizing and destructive forms of ethnicity, specifically the racist power structures and values of apartheid and white supremacy. In hindsight, the actions of the Lutheran World Federation were modest, especially considering that it took 14 years and 3 LWF assemblies to create and enforce the policy that member churches are not allowed to discriminate at the altar on the basis of race. Both at the time and in retrospect, however, the action of the LWF against apartheid is among the most visible steps that Lutherans have taken together on a global institutional level. It provides a compelling model for future witness to gospel freedom and political accountability. Not sure if you'd heard that story before in terms of the disinvestment and the boycott against South Africa and Namibia and the apartheid regimes there. But I do wonder, what would you consider status confessionis today? A professor of ours in seminary wrote a book saying that hunger is status confessionis, that there is absolutely no reason that anybody should be hungry in this world, and that it is a matter of the gospel, of the basic rights and needs of humans, that they should be fed. And if you think about Jesus feeding people over and over, eating with them, of Jesus declaring himself the bread of the world. For that professor, Dr. Craig Nesson, his book says that there is no reason for anybody to be hungry, and that it is in fact a status confessionis. That's one proposal, one example. What would you say is so core to the gospel, so core to God's relationship with humanity, that is an issue or a problem in our world right now, that it could be deemed status confessionis and have the full attention and focus of the Lutheran Church and others brought to bear upon it? Part 2. The challenge to be an authentically multicultural church. Albert Starr Jr. is the author of this. Well, the bridge between the first one and this one is right at the end there, that there's nothing wrong with ethnicity, but maybe we should work to bridge the gaps a little bit and work against the destructive use of ethnicity. Let me get the quote again. I think it's worth repeating. Let me find my page. It's silly and close the book. The church has a role to play in encouraging coexistence and harmony among different ethnic groups, okay? And if that is not reflected within the church, even a little bit, then whatever we say to other people kind of rings hollow. So here we go. More than 25 years into this journey together that we call the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, we find ourselves moving quickly toward the intersection of the observance of the 500th anniversary of the Reformation and what may well be some of the most racially turbulent times in this country since the civil rights era of the late 1950s and 60s. Again, this was written in or compiled in 2016. He wasn't wrong. We can celebrate that the relentlessly gracious presence of God is indeed constantly redeeming and renewing who we are as church. We can celebrate the good news and sacred promise that our God won't leave us alone. We can celebrate that our God is Emmanuel, with us always. We can, though I'm not sure just how much we do, celebrate that our God won't abandon us to be consumed by a diet of shallow celebration. We can celebrate that our God agitates and irritates in ways that reveal our real brokenness. We can celebrate that our broken places are where we can best see that precious grace of God at work in ways that make us even more who we really are. Writers like Soong Chan Ra remind us of the power of prophetic lamentation that, quote, calls for justice in troubled times. The crying out to God in lament over a broken history is often set aside in favor of a triumphalistic narrative. We are too busy patting ourselves on the back over the problem-solving abilities of the triumphant American church to cry out to God in lament, end quote. We must be equally ready to acknowledge that, like generations of the church and society before us, much of our diversity may most honestly be measured in our broad range of readiness or lack of readiness for being a multicultural church with depth and integrity. The meaning of multicultural. It does not serve us well to allow ourselves to slip into careless references to multicultural as meaning any congregation or context other than white. It is not honest for us to allow ourselves the presumed luxury of thinking that increasing the number of people of color on our membership rolls is consistently reflective of equitable sharing of power in matters of leadership and the continuous work of defining, quote, Lutheran identity, end quote. It diminishes our true celebration of diversity to allow among us such narrow definitions of diversity that we have congregations and church leaders who say, we're pretty much an all-white community, we don't have any diversity. The inability to recognize the wealth of diversity among us across socioeconomic, educational, and other cultural strata speaks volumes to the vast opportunity ahead of us as a church to truly deepen our capacity to recognize and value diversity across racial, ethnic, and other lines. While we can celebrate the creating of ethnic-specific strategic plans adopted at church-wide assemblies, a number of social justice statements and volumes of resources developed to help us as a church in our quest for becoming a truly multicultural church. We must confess that none of these tools will do the hard and demanding work for us. Ours is the work of building honest relationships as the beloved community. Covenant, in fact, is where we are perhaps most challenged as church, and that challenge is equally our greatest and most exciting frontier. In 2015, in conversation with colleagues gathered in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, for the Asian Lutheran International Conference, it was clear as we reflected on where we were, both in context and in life of the church, that we are being called toward real reformation in this 21st century. We were challenged. Quote, nowhere in the life of our church is the call for genuine reformation more evident than in our church's need for authentic engagement of people of color and people living impacted by poverty in every aspect of the life of our church, end quote. To borrow from Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann, we can, quote, we can along the way redecide our notion of church. The covenant construct permits us and requires us to think afresh about the character and business of church, end quote. We can celebrate standing on the cutting edge of experiencing our shared covenant relationship as the body of Christ more deeply than ever, as we are agitated toward truth as God is incarnate among us in our relationship to one another. We can celebrate that our always present, agitating God will not leave us alone, nor allow us the illusion that our true call is to anything but relationship. Let me pause a second. Where is God agitating you? Where is God irritating you? In what direction? I've heard the line, God comforts the afflicted and afflicts the comfortable. And the more people we have relationship with who are all bearing the image of God, the deeper and wider and more authentic our relationship with Christ is, because we're seeing more of God. If you only ever look at folks like you, then you're getting a limited picture of what the image of God really is. Where do you see God incarnate in your relationships? Where is God agitating you, irritating you? And what illusions is God trying to disillusion you away from? Continuing on. Making the invisible visible. It has been a most debilitating part of our prevailing historical narrative as a church that people of color and people living in high poverty circumstances are often seen more as recipients than resources. It is still painfully true in far too many contexts that our synods, church-related agencies and organizations, and congregations have not developed the depth of relationship with people of color that affords our church, in its many expressions, full opportunity to benefit from the passions, gifts, and capacity of people of color. It is an even more painful truth that an untold number of people of color remain members of ELCA congregations, but find themselves searching for engagement of their gifts outside the church. Still more tragic are instances where people of color are relegated to searching for their own authentic identity and sense of self outside their church, apart from their faith, because of narrowly defined, culturally bound notions of what it means to be Christian from a Lutheran, theological, or ecclesiastical perspective. I think I've shared this before, that the Lutheran culture of Scandinavia and Germany and Garrison Keillor and liturgically correct Jello, that's Lutheran culture. That's not Lutheran theology. And our Lutheran theology is still lacking if we don't hear the voices of all these different stories that are contained in these books and beyond, and especially in people and other people's experiences that are different from our own. Yes, we celebrate the persons and places where the gifts and capacity of people of color are valued and involved in meaningful ways to further the mission, ministry, and life of the church, but we cannot afford illusions and false equivalencies. We celebrate the faithful engagement, and we lament the squandered opportunities to fully embrace and fully welcome. Reports show that in the first 10 years of the existence of the ELCA, from 1988 to 1998, the number of people of color who were active members increased in every ethnic community and category, while ELCA membership among European Americans declined over that same period. From 2009 to 2014, the number of active members who were people of color fell by an estimated 6.9%, compared to the church's overall 20.4% decline over what most would agree to be a tumultuous 6-year period. When I heard these words, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, fasting and praying before the God of heaven. It's Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 4. It was hearing the tragic condition of his people in peril that ushered Nehemiah into his prophetic role. When we hear the continuous reports of our church, the ELCA, declining and faltering in our call to be a church that reflects the holy vision of God's creative hand manifest in the diversity of God's people, will we just sit down? Will we just mourn the prevailing report? Or will we fast from the dictates of systems, structures, and budgets that nourish some while starving others? Do we just want more reports that allude to progress we clearly know is yet to be attained? Or will we step into the presence of the one who is able to do exceedingly and abundantly more than we can ask or imagine? To pray, really pray, knowing that to pray is to be changed. Like Nehemiah, we are in a season that calls for more boldness than we've demonstrated, levels of investment that will draw on resources up to now left unengaged, and a willingness to go to some places we've only heard about from others. If I had to speak on where the future of Lutheranism lies, what our 6th century will look like, I would say that unless the declining churches in North America and Northern Europe really start learning from and wanting to learn from the experiences of Lutherans that don't look like me, we're just going to keep declining. We're going to keep going down until we are done or until we hit some sort of critical mass and bounce back. But I don't think that's going to happen unless we become open to some new things. Whatever that looks like, whether that's worship or service, whether that's how we make our budgets and spend them, whether that's the songs we sing, the prayers we pray, our willingness to be changed, probably more than anything. Lutherans aren't alone in this, but Lutherans are really good at saying, but that's how we do it. That's how we've always done it. Why isn't it working anymore? We just need to do it more, and then we'll be back to where it used to be. After 40 plus years of decline, maybe it's time to realize that that's not going to work. By hearing these stories over these 5 weeks and more, and I hope you can find more of your own from other Lutherans, from other Christians, and just from others, period. Until we start seeing what God has at work in the world around us, if we just stay insulated in our own safe bubbles, that decline is going to continue. But I don't think that's what God wants for us. I think the reforming church is, as they said, due for more reformation. That is one of our slogans, after all. Semper Reformanda. I think it's how it goes. I'm not a Latin person, but always reforming. I think we're due. I hope these stories inspired you. I hope they made you curious to learn more. They did for me. And I hope that God will disillusion you in the best way possible. And that we can figure out what our current status confessionis is, or more than one, and get to work. We are freed from having to make God love us, but we are definitely freed for the work that God gives us. Thanks for listening. I'll stay tuned. I'm not sure what we're doing next. I have an idea, but stay tuned. And we'll keep putting these midweek messages out there. And I hope you keep watching. Take care, and God's blessings be with you. And may you be able to get some glimpses from God's perspective. See you next time.